Did you know Cain killed his own brother Abel, two sons of the very first man and woman, one offering accepted, one rejected, and somewhere between that rejection and a quiet field, blood is spilled for the very first time in human history. But the real story is far stranger than the one we were taught in Sunday school, and it starts before either brother was even born. Let's go back to the beginning. Adam and Eve have just been driven out of Eden. The ground is cursed. Childbirth is painful, everything easy has become hard, and into that broken world two sons are born. Cain comes first. He works the soil just like his father. Abel comes next. He keeps flocks, wandering with sheep across land that no longer gives freely. Two brothers, two very different lives. Already something is set in motion. Notice something easy to miss. Cain's name in Hebrew is tied to the word forgotten or acquired. Eve even says it herself when he's born. She has gotten a man with the help of the Lord. Abel's name means something closer to breath or vapor, something fleeting, something that doesn't last. Two names given at birth that somehow foreshadow exactly how this story ends. Coincidence? Maybe. But scripture rarely wastes a detail like that. Genesis chapter 4 tells us both brothers bring an offering to God. Cain brings the fruit of his labor, the produce of the ground. Abel brings the firstborn of his flock, the best portions, the fat. And here's where the story turns strange. God accepts Abel's offering. He does not accept Cain's. No explanation is given in the text. No instructions were broken that we are told about. Just a divine yes to one brother and a divine no to the other. Can you imagine standing there, watching your brother be favored, with no reason given at all? That's the moment most retellings stop at. Jealousy, they say. Cain got jealous, so he killed Abel. Simple, clean, done. But that reading skips something enormous, something sitting right there in the text that almost nobody talks about in Sunday school. Before the murder happens, God speaks to Cain directly, not to punish him, not yet. God asks him why he's angry, why his face has fallen. And then God says something remarkable. Sin is crouching at the door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. Read that again. God doesn't just warn Cain that anger is dangerous. God personifies sin as a predator, crouching, waiting, hungry. It's not a metaphor for a bad mood. It's a warning about a living threat coiled outside the door of Cain's heart. And Cain had a choice. That's the strange part almost nobody sits with. This wasn't inevitable. God gave him a warning, an off-ramp, a chance to master what was rising in him. He chose not to take it. So here's the question worth pausing on. What was Cain actually angry about? Was it only the offering, or was something older already at work? Something about being the firstborn, the one who was supposed to matter most, watching his younger brother get chosen instead? We'll come back to that, because the answer changes how we understand every family rivalry that echoes this one for the rest of Scripture. Cain invites Abel out to the field. The text is almost clinical about what happens next. Cain rose up against his brother and killed him. No weapon is named. No motive is spelled out beyond what we already know. Just violence, sudden and final, in an open field under an open sky. The first death in human history is not from old age, not from illness, not from the fall itself. It's a brother's hand against a brother's life. Then God asks a question that still echoes through every courtroom, every confession, every guilty conscience in history. Where is your brother Abel? And Cain answers with the most famous deflection ever recorded. Am I my brother's keeper? 4 words. And in those 4 words, Cain reveals exactly what has died alongside Abel. Not just a life, but a relationship, a responsibility, an entire way of understanding what it means to belong to someone else. But that's still not the strangest part of this story. The strangest part is what God does next. Not to Abel, whose blood the text says is crying out from the ground. To Cain, the murderer, you would expect a death sentence, an eye for an eye. Instead, Cain is cursed to wander, exiled from the ground he once worked. And Cain protests. He says the punishment is too heavy to bear, that whoever finds him will kill him. And God's response is the part almost nobody remembers. God places a mark on Cain, not a mark of shame for others to point at, a mark of protection. God declares that anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over. Sit with that for a second. The first murderer in human history is not executed. He is protected. The God who just heard his brother's blood crying out from the ground chooses mercy over retribution for the one who spilled it. Why? Why protect the man who ended the very first human life? That question has puzzled readers for thousands of years, and it's about to get even stranger. Because Cain doesn't disappear into some barren wasteland to live out a quiet, punished life. He goes to the land of Nod, east of Eden, and he builds something, a city. He names it after his son, Enoch. Think about that. The first murderer becomes the first city builder. violence and civilization tangled together from the very start of human history outside of Eden, and his descendants don't fade into obscurity either. Generations later, a man named Lamech, Cain's own bloodline, boasts to his wives about killing a man and declares that if Cain is avenged 7 times, he will be avenged 77 times. The shadow of that first field doesn't just linger. It grows generation after generation until an entire family line is defined by it. Meanwhile, back in Eden's shadow, Adam and Eve have another son, Seth. Genesis tells us it's through Seth's line, not Cain's, that humanity's story continues toward Noah, and eventually toward the rest of the biblical narrative. 2 brothers who never fired an arrow at each other, 2 family lines, splitting apart in that single field and never fully reuniting again in Scripture. Here's the open thread worth sitting with. If God shows Cain mercy, if God marks him for protection rather than death, what does that tell us about how this story is meant to be read? Not as a simple morality tale where the bad brother gets what's coming to him. Something else is happening here, something about how even the worst of us remains within reach of a God who refuses to let vengeance have the final word. Now here's the twist that reframes everything we thought we understood about this story. We tend to read Cain and Abel as a story about one man's uncontrolled rage, but look closer at the pattern God actually names. Sin crouching at the door, desiring to have him. That's not a description of a single bad decision made in a single bad moment. That's a description of something ongoing, something that had already been circling Cain long before he ever raised his hand. The murder wasn't the beginning of the problem. It was the result of a problem Cain had already been losing to, quietly, internally, for who knows how long before God even mentioned it. And that reframes the favored offering too. Maybe it was never really about worship at all. Maybe the offering was simply the moment Cain's hidden resentment finally had somewhere to go, a place to attach itself, a reason to become visible, which means the real danger in this story isn't a single bad offering or a single unfair moment. It's what happens inside a person long before the moment ever arrives, the crouching thing at the door that nobody else can see. There's something else worth noticing here, something that gets lost in translation. The Hebrew word used for sin, crouching, is the same word used elsewhere in the ancient world for a wild animal lying in wait outside a doorway. Not sleeping, not passive, hunting. God isn't describing an emotion that will simply fade if Cain waits it out. God is describing a predator that will strike the moment the door is left unguarded. And doors in this story are never just physical. They're the small, private moments of decision that nobody else ever sees. So what happened between the warning and the field? Scripture doesn't tell us directly, and that silence is its own kind of teaching. We don't get to watch Cain wrestle with the crouching thing. We only get the warning and then the result, which means the real battle, the one that actually decided everything, happened somewhere Scripture never shows us. In private, unwitnessed. Exactly where most of our own battles happen too. This is where the story stops being ancient history and starts being uncomfortably close to home. Because most of us will never stand in a field with a stone in our hand. But how many of us have felt that same crouching thing when someone else gets chosen, promoted, praised, loved, in a way we weren't? How many of us have felt our own face fall, the way Cain's did, when we watched someone else receive what we secretly believed we deserved? The story of Cain and Abel isn't really a story about murder. It's a story about the gap between the moment we feel that resentment rising and the moment we decide what to do with it. And that gap is where the real story of every human family lives. Siblings who stop speaking for years over an inheritance or a perceived favorite. Co-workers who quietly undermine each other after one gets the promotion the other wanted. Friendships that curdle into cold silence because one person got chosen and the other didn't. None of it looks like a field in Nod. Nobody's reaching for a stone. But the crouching thing at the door is the same thing every time. Unnamed, unexamined, waiting for someone to open the door and let it in. So when we ask why Cain killed Abel, the honest answer isn't jealousy. Jealousy was only the trigger. The real answer is that Cain lost a fight nobody could see. A fight that had been happening in him long before he ever stepped into that field. God warned him. God gave him the chance to rule over it. And still, he opened the door. So yes, Cain killed Abel. But now we know the field was never really where the story began. It began at a door, with a warning, and a choice quietly made long before the stone was ever lifted.